We're going to begin our afternoon with a session on environmental security and sustaining peace, organized by Dr. Josh Fisher, who is the director of the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity here at Columbia. Josh?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Fisher. I'm the director of AC4, the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. It's one of 14 research centers at the Columbia Climate School. We focus on the intersection of peace, conflict, and sustainability, understanding that we can't have a sustainable world if we're mired in conflict, and likewise that there's a peace-building and environmentally and socially productive dividend that comes from the pursuit of sustainability. It's an honor to be part of the Geography 2050 conference and to host this conversation on environmental security and sustaining peace. I have the real honor of being joined by two colleagues, both internationally renowned for their research and policy-focused practice. Paige Fortna is the Harold Brown Professor of U.S. Foreign and Security Policy in the Department of Political Science. She's also the director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies here at Columbia. Her research focuses on international politics of climate change, terrorism, the durability of peace in the aftermath of both civil and interstate wars, and war termination. And she's currently working on projects on regional security and climate change and the power in the international system, and terrorism and civil wars. Carl Bruch is the Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute and the founding president of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, a professional association that connects scholars and practitioners around the world. His work focuses on environmental peacebuilding, particularly after conflict, environmental governance, adaptation, and environmental emergencies. And he's worked with dozens of countries, including many post-conflict and conflict-affected countries throughout Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Europe to strengthen their environmental laws, institutions, and practices. And I'm excited to have a conversation with both of my colleagues here and to join overlapping concentric professional circles, but also to have a conversation with you, the audience. We've seen and touched on many themes over the last 2 days. I'm sure you have burning questions, many of which are relevant and salient for our conversation here. And so we'll have a chance to engage directly with you. To set the stage for the conversation, though, I'd like to briefly highlight some of the linkages between a changing climate and environmental security. So in our talk yesterday, Dr. Burkett highlighted that a warming planet will impact environmental systems and geographic regions in distinct ways at different levels of warming. This graphic from the IPCC shows what will happen to heat, soil moisture, and precipitation at different levels of warming. What it shows is that with every increment of warming, climate means and extremes become more widespread and pronounced. But what's really crucial to understand about these changes, both the means and the extremes, is that what they represent is destabilization of our Earth system and its life support functions, things like trophic structures, ecosystem function, ecosystem services. Not necessarily the destruction of these things, but the disruption and destabilization of the Earth system. So when we think about the impacts of that destabilization, we tend to model out decades and centuries, but we know that we're already experiencing the impacts of some of the systems being destabilized, and that we're on a trajectory to exceed the 1.5 degree warming threshold set out by the Paris Agreement, probably within this decade. How high peak warming will reach, how long we stay above the pre-industrial levels, all influence which environmental systems destabilize, and we're already seeing troubling signs in our ocean currents, our ice sheets, and in biodiversity. So in 2023, the University of Exeter produced this report called Tipping Points that examined the ways in which changes to these support systems, to these Earth systems, can cascade across one another, across the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, lithosphere, cryosphere, and biosphere. And importantly, they highlighted the ways in which those cascading tipping points can impact societies and social systems. In section 2 of the Tipping Points report, these scientists describe 4 pathways through which a destabilized social system can lead to conflict. Disruption of financial markets and livelihoods, destabilization of political institutions, changes to human settlements, migration, and resource access, and increased polarization, radicalization, and loss of trust in our institutions. Thanks to extensive work by ecologists, we have some frameworks to try and understand how systems change and how systems respond to change. Things like this complex adaptive cycle. These frameworks, and particularly this framework, the complex adaptive cycle, describes how systems move through moments of destabilization, disturbance, growth, stability, rigidity, collapse, and ultimately reorganization. Importantly, it's in these moments of system rigidity that we start to see cracks in the system. And those cracks can ultimately cascade into the destabilization of the system, resulting in collapse. It's here that we have opportunities and moments of conflict, when the system order collapses, when our institutions no longer enable us to each negotiate and navigate our needs, interests with one another. So it's in these moments of collapse that we have moments of conflict. Often those conflicts turn violent or destructive. We're seeing a lot of that today in the world. But they don't have to. There's no path dependency here. There's also an opportunity for the system to reorganize in ways that it's better adapted to helping stakeholders and citizens and societies meet their needs. We can reorganize and we can nudge the system to reorganize in ways that it's better adapted to the evolving context. As Denise McKenzie highlighted this morning, that's a choice, right? When we have these moments of collapse, when we have these moments of tension, it's a choice. It's an individual choice. It's a societal choice. It's an international organizational choice. So we have choices to make. I'm interested today to speak with my colleagues on what they see as some of the most pressing environmental security concerns they're seeing both in their own research and their own practice, and in their work to convene networks of colleagues and scientists and scholars all working on these intersectional issues. And I'm interested to hear from you as well, what your concerns are, what you're seeing in your day-to-day life, in your practice, in your research, in your policy making. And so I'm excited to have this conversation. So the first question that I'd like to ask in our conversation today is really, what are the critical environmental concerns? And following that, what are the pathways and tools for peace building? And so we'll turn now to a conversation with our colleagues. Both of these colleagues, Paige and Carl, have spent their professional careers really exploring these questions of environmental security, of peace building, peacekeeping, peacemaking, especially in areas that are destabilized. And so I'll start with you, Paige. Okay. You've done extensive work on terrorism, on peacekeeping. More recently, you've been building networks and hosting dialogues among regional experts focused on climate change. What are you seeing in your research and your practice?
Well, lots of things, lots of pressing issues. And I thought I would say a little bit about what issues I think kind of need the most attention in my field. So I'm a political scientist. I study international relations, security studies. So as I think many of you heard yesterday, unfortunately I couldn't attend the panels yesterday, but I know that there was a panel on the linkages between climate change and conflict. And that literature has focused, not exclusively, but for the most part, on conflict at the level of civil war, so intrastate conflicts that happen between governments and non-state actors or opposition groups within a country, and trying to understand the relationship between our changing climate and the propensity or intensity of those conflicts. And that's a fantastic literature that I have learned a ton from, and I think it continues to tell us quite a lot. But I want to push on a couple of things that I think, places where I think that literature maybe, I don't want to say falls short, but has yet to sort of tackle the challenges. So one of them is that as social scientists, we use the past, sometimes the very recent past, but the past to understand the present and the future. So we look at data on what has happened in the past when there has been unusual levels of rainfall, floods or droughts or temperature anomalies, and how has that led to conflict or not led to conflict. Which is great, that's the data we have, and in some sense we're limited to that, but we're now facing a world where we're going to see unprecedented climactic events, unprecedented heat and cold temperatures, unprecedented levels of rainfall or drought. And so trying to understand whether we can just extrapolate in sort of a linear way from what we've seen before to what we will see in the future, which is how a lot of the modeling happens. As I said, it's kind of what we've got to work with. On the other hand, we sort of know that the past is not going to be a prologue to the future because we're in this unprecedented world. And so I think as social scientists trying to figure out how to grapple with the uncertainties around that, around tipping points, around compound issues. So we sort of tend to model like, okay, well, what happens when we see excess heat? Okay, but what happens when we're seeing excess heat and storms and other things and migrate, all of these things happening at the same time? How can we wrap our heads around that as social scientists to have some sense of what might be coming, the train wreck that's coming, as somebody put it earlier. And I don't have a great answer to that, but I think the kinds of modeling and thinking outside the ways that we've been thinking so far are going to be important. And then the other thing I thought I would say about this literature on conflict, on climate change and conflict so far is that it is, as I said, mostly focused at the intrastate level, but there are also big issues taking place at regional levels of groups of states that share a watershed, say, or share other access to natural resources and how those kinds of security dynamics are going to play out. There's quite a bit of research there, but on particular regions, but one thing I'm hoping the field will move towards is thinking about regional security in a comparative sense. So thinking about what are the kinds of issues that we're seeing repeated across regions, and what are the things that are unique to specific regions, and how can we understand individual regions better by studying other regions as well. And then at the global level, I think this is the international relations folks who've looked at climate change have tended to look at issues around reaching international agreements, the Kyoto Protocol and all of that, but a little bit less on the security side, thinking about the big geostrategic implications of climate change, with important exceptions, including, I think, the people who were just on stage winning awards. But I've been thinking a little bit about how climate change and responses to it, that is a rapid decarbonization of our economy, how those processes will play out for fundamental concepts in how we understand international politics. So, for example, power in the international system. And I don't mean power in the sense of how we generate electricity. I mean power in the sense of great powers and power, the ways in which states influence each other. And so, we can think about the kinds of impacts that climate change will have on the economic bases of states' power, on demographic power, thinking about all of the stuff that we've been hearing today about migration and where people are moving. Also, mortality and fertility rates will be affected by climate change. And then, of course, military power, which, again, we heard some of that earlier today, from things like vulnerability of naval bases to the ways in which military forces can operate in heat and cold, and all kinds of implications, both of a kind of unmitigated climate disaster scenario, but also implications on all of those aspects of power of a rapid technological change away from fossil fuels and leaving stranded assets of oil and coal that a lot of states' power is based on, and making other resources more important. And so there are going to be really big geopolitical shifts coming down the pike. under either of those scenarios, and really the future is going to be somewhere between those things. We're going to have some climate disaster happening, and we're going to have these economic and technological changes happening at the same time. And so then thinking about, well, what does that mean for peace and conflict in the international system? We generally know, or think we know, at least again based on the past, that when there are rapid and especially poorly understood shifts in power in the international system, or shifts in power within societies, that tends to be destabilizing. We're more likely to get conflict and violent conflict. The ability to bargain over things can break down if you don't know how strong you are relative to the other side you're bargaining with. And we also know and are beginning to see already when there are big shifts and instability in economic and human well-being, what that does to political institutions. And so I think the political ramifications of these larger global shifts are still not well known, but they're troubling. I don't think they're deterministically problematic, but they're things we need to worry about. So we've seen in the last year or so massive swings away from incumbent governments. Incumbent governments are falling all over the world, not just in the US. So people are dissatisfied with the people in power, and they're swinging to somebody else. And to some extent, and in some places, that looks like a shift to the right. People are more worried about immigration, they're more worried about security, they're more likely to favor strongman politics, and so there's a sort of rightward and authoritarian shift, but there's also a sense of just instability of countries swinging from right to left and back and forth across politics. So what that will mean over time, I think, we need to do a lot of work to try to figure out. And then maybe on a more optimistic note, which I think will, after Carl speaks, maybe a segue into your second question, I think in a more optimistic sense, maybe all of this political upheaval provides some opportunity for more radical, positive political change to both our global institutions, our national institutions, and local level institutions. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Really profound questions that you've raised, really profound issues you've raised. And when we talk about solutions and sort of the peace building side or the positive social change side, I want to touch on a couple of these. But first, Carl, you've spent much of your career both working with governments and stakeholders to reform their institutions. You've also spent much of the last few years of your career building this association of this network of people engaged in research, engaged in practice around these issues. What are you seeing in the world as some of the pressing environmental security challenges, issues we need to be attuned to, gaps in knowledge?
It was interesting listening to Paige because we did not compare notes beforehand. And I think we come from very different backgrounds. And there's a lot of agreement just in our short list. Kind of at the top of my list is this collection of cascading and cumulative impacts of climate change through all the different pathways we've been talking about the last couple of days. The human impacts, the social impacts, the economic impacts, which have social impacts and human impacts. And all of that, what does that mean for government and the trust in government, or the distrust in government that we're seeing rise in many places, which makes it that much harder to find solutions. Food security, migration, migration that then shuts down borders that were formerly open. All of that kind of being the effect of climate change on security, human security, national security. And then the second category, which Paige also touched on, is what's often called backdraft. It's not the effects of climate change. It's the effects of our responses to climate change. We want renewable energy. What does that mean? Well, we need these minerals. And now there's this great contestation over who has access to lithium, to rare earth minerals, to copper, playing out across Latin America, Africa, Asia, even in the US. And the There are people who are concerned about a green resource curse. It's like these minerals are needed for the green energy revolution driving conflict. And there is in the climate community, I would say more broadly in the environmental community, I'm not talking the security, but the enviros, many suffer from what you might call a white hat syndrome. We're saving the world. We're saving the world as we know it. We're saving species. And all the forces are aligned against us. We're doing the good work. And it is inconceivable that they might be doing harm. Or if there's harm, well, this is a transaction cost. The point is, they're not conflict sensitive. And this is a recipe for disaster in terms of say, okay, we'll just move people here without saying, is that actually feasible? What are the effects of that? And when you actually ask people about this, they often have no answer. They haven't thought about it. And the defense is, well, you have to do something. Yeah, you could do something and make it worse. We need to be thinking in a much more integrated way. Not only how do we mainstream environment into security, but how do we mainstream considerations of peace and security into the environment? And I have to say the security community is much farther along in this integration thinking than the environment community. Separately, and Paige also touched on this, but I think it's important to be thinking about it. Totally removed from climate change, there has been a rise in populism, a breakdown in international governance. I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have spent most of my career in an era of growing globalism and international cooperation and the building and strengthening of international regimes. We are now seeing through multiple pathways those regimes and norms being undermined. At the very time we need to be cooperating. So this is not about climate change, but it's about our ability to respond to the environmental security risks. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, we saw a growing attention by the Security Council to natural resources and the role that that played in driving conflicts, in financing conflicts, and now with the growing tensions, we're seeing a growing number of vetoes. And this does not bode well for the ability of the Security Council to maintain international peace and security around environmental and climate change related issues. Another point which I think is, it's more my personal point, but it does have a big picture dynamic, and that is accountability for aggression and wartime environmental damage. This is something I've worked on my entire career. And it's different than the peace building side of it, but it's very closely tied through kind of this linkage between justice and peace. And when Iraq was held liable for the invasion of Kuwait, 1990 to 91, one of the big elements of the claims were the environmental damage. And this was not predicated on long-term widespread severe damage to the environment or other international standards. It was predicated on illegal aggression. Iraq invaded Kuwait, therefore it was liable for all the damages. Colin Powell referred to it as the Pottery Barn Doctrine. You break it, you buy it. And it provides a powerful disincentive to aggressive war that violates the UN Charter. We now have a growing number of conflicts, including in Ukraine, that the question is, how do you hold nations accountable for aggressive war and for including the environmental damage? And if you don't, what does that mean for, say, the South China Sea? Is there a free pass, particularly for powerful nations? And what does that do for our ability to meet the needs of the climate disaster. The final thing that I wanted to flag is a lot of these dynamics have very strong components of the geophysical world, climate, resources, territory, and the social side. We have an amazing collection of data on the geophysical side. And we can make all these wonderful maps. We have a certain amount of data on the social side. But first of all, a lot of the data, especially when it comes to fragility, is at the national level. It's not localized. The ACLID database, which was presented yesterday, is trying to get at more localized conflicts. It's, the best thing we have in that respect. Doesn't mean that that it couldn't be a lot better. But we also have questions around how do you capture questions around the rule of law? What are the indicators? Okay, we could do perception, like the Corruption Perception Index. But that's just a perception. It's maybe the best thing we have. But the quality of data, the granularity of the data on the social side is really lacking. Moreover, the question is, from a modeling perspective, how do you integrate these data sets to say what is truly a hotspot? Which elements do you weight heavier? And what is the evidentiary basis for that? And I think this is something that, whether it's the intelligence community or the diplomatic community or the development community or the environment community, these are all things that we desperately need to know, and we are far from being able to do it. And so I just want to put that out there, this question of better integrating the social and geophysical data sets and the models underpinning that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Paige, anything you wanted to respond to?
Well, maybe two thoughts that occurred to me while you were speaking. One is a question that I think we do not know the answer to yet about whether the instability that we're seeing in the physical world from climate change is actually related to the rise of populism. I think, it's maybe not. Maybe it's post-COVID and other kinds of things going on. But I think it's possible that the kinds of instability that we're seeing in the world, particularly the beginnings of the implications of climate change on migration and the political pressures that is putting on receiving states, I think may not be completely unrelated. And I think that's just an open empirical question that we need more work on. And then the other thing I would completely agree with you that we have better data, we have better modeling on the physical side than on the social side. I often joke with my friends who are in the natural sciences or kind of push back when somebody refers to the hard sciences as opposed to the social sciences. The hard sciences have it easy. It's much harder to understand humans and how they interact in the world because they have agency than it is to understand the physical thing. So just complete agreement with you on that point, yeah.
Great, and I have the luxury and curse of working on both the physical science and the social science side. Both are complicated. The social side is particularly so because, as the panel, 2 panels ago, I think, touched on, there are also justice issues. Whose data, who owns the data, what are the risks in using these data, making these data public? Certainly the data are highly valuable, highly useful, and using them doesn't come without a certain cost. But I agree with you both on all these points. A couple of the things that you've raised that really stick out to me are, one, to move forward either on the climate action side or on the social governance, peace, and conflict management side. It really is a collective action problem, both intranationally and internationally. We need to get people to move together, to make decisions together, in the face of huge power imbalances and changing power balances, in the face of erosion of trust in our institutions, in the face of institutions that are somehow difficult to hold accountable, as Carl said, and difficult to maintain on track. And so as we move to our second question, at the local level, at the national level, at the international level, how do we overcome some of these collective action problems? How do we mobilize action? What have you seen that actually works, either in a place, a space, or theoretically, or in research? What are you seeing that can help us move our policymakers, move our communities toward better joint action? Maybe Paige?
Thanks, yeah. Well, pick up on one thing you just said about collective action. So it is true that the climate and its ability to absorb carbon dioxide is a problem of the commons, and I think the collective action problem framework for understanding it is extremely important. But there's also been interesting work on the sort of international politics of climate change suggesting that it's not only a collective action problem. There are kind of interesting facts or factoids that suggest that to some extent states have an incentive and are moving forward on climate mitigation policies even when other states aren't, or other actors aren't. So for example, Taiwan, which is not a recognized state, and so has no obligation under the international, the Kyoto Protocol to do anything on climate action, actually has a climate policy. And so to some extent, it's a collective action problem in the sense that the benefits from it can't be excluded. But in other cases, there are actually private incentives, as we would call them in political science, that Taiwan has political reasons, domestic political reasons, to create at least somewhat ambitious climate policy. And so it's a combination of collective action problem and distribution problems of which countries will benefit and which countries will lose under a transition away from fossil fuels, for example. And so I think that's an interesting place where we have pretty good understanding in political science of collective action problems and the problems, the sort of obstacles to cooperation there, and we have a pretty good understanding of what happens with distributive conflicts and sort of who loses and who wins, relatively speaking, from climate change or from mitigation. But how those play out together, how the dynamics of those play out at the same time is kind of a new and interesting realm. Not something that I'm working on personally, but colleagues that are working on. And so I think that's, in terms of the framework to think about it, I think that's quite interesting. But in answer to the question about, what has worked and what might therefore work in the future, again, with the caveat that the past might not be like the future. So I'll say a little bit about some of my earlier research. It's on institutions for peace building and maintaining peace in the aftermath of conflict. So not the research I'm working on now, but a project that I finished a few years ago looked at the practice of peacekeeping. So by this I mean a multilateral mission, often run through the UN, but not always, of states that get together and show up in a place that has conflict, almost always invited by that place to come and help either to get to a peace agreement and then especially to help maintain peace in the immediate aftermath of war. So that's sort of how do you get people who have been actively killing each other to stop killing each other and then keep from going back to killing each other. And peacekeeping, I'm guessing in a room of people who don't work on this specifically, most of you have a general sense that peacekeeping's kind of a disaster, right? The UN is inefficient. You can think about cases where there were peacekeeping missions and things went horribly wrong. Haiti, Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo. We tend to know about the failed cases. But actually this research, mine and other people's who've looked kind of systematically across cases where there have been conflicts, comparing places that had peacekeeping missions to places that did not have peacekeeping missions and trying to take into account the kind of difficulty of maintaining peace across different kinds of scenarios, we actually see a really quite remarkable effectiveness of this institution, despite all of its flaws and problems, which are myriad, that the chance of reaching peace is higher when peacekeeping is involved, the level of killing of civilians is lower, and then for my research, what I've focused on is the chance that war resumes in the aftermath of peace. It falls by, depending on how you count, up to about 80% reduction in the chance of a war resuming. And that's just like a thing that the world has developed, since World War II to deal with conflicts, first in interstate conflicts and then applied to civil conflicts. And it works really well. And it's also really cheap. The peacekeeping budget of the UN is like significantly lower than the New York City Police Department's budget. And it's maintaining peace in places all around the world. So we do have these tools out there, many of which are effective, some of which we know quite a lot about the effectiveness, some of them we don't know quite as much. So I think there are tools out there that as we think about conflicts coming down the road, we have in our toolbox. And so that's, peacekeeping in recent years has been mostly used at the intrastate level, the level of civil wars. But then also thinking kind of more broadly about the architecture that was built up after the cataclysm of World War II, both at the regional level, regional institutions in Europe that kind of evolved into the European Union, and then at the global level, the whole kind of architecture of the international system, the institutions of the international financial system, the international laws of war and IHL, which we were hearing about earlier. They didn't start after World War II, but they were developed quite significantly in the aftermath of World War II. The creation of the UN system, which does peacekeeping and lots of other things around the world. So all of those things they came out of a crisis. They're all under strain at the moment for various political reasons that we've touched on and others that we haven't. But they were created by humans in the face of crisis, and they have done a huge amount of good in the world. We had a long stretch of relative global peace. Not that there was peace everywhere. There were certainly wars during the Cold War, but relative to the period that had come before, a much more peaceful world. And so, I don't know, I guess I'm an optimist at heart. It can be hard some days, but I am at heart. So I think that these kinds of crises can leave room for reforming institutions, rebuilding institutions. Those institutions that came out of World War II were created in large part through the leadership of the US as the hegemon in the international system. And at the moment, the US's appetite for that kind of leadership in the world is wobbly at best. I think those institutions have some resilience. Once created, they don't necessarily need the US to even stay within them. As we saw with the Paris Agreement, the US pulled out and the thing kept chugging along, and the US got back in and it kept chugging along better, and the US is probably gonna pull out again. And I'm not gonna say that that's not a bad thing. It would work better with the US in it than out, but it's not gonna completely collapse without the US. And I think also, again, maybe an optimistic kind of spin on this is that some opportunity for other powers in the world, China, India, and others, to have more of a role in those international institutions, and for the global south writ large, including smaller and less powerful states, to have more of a voice. There are opportunities for greater legitimacy and buy-in from the whole world, if that's how things go.
Excellent. And just thinking back to your earlier comment, that also has an inflection point as we re-establish different balance of power, shifting responsibility, opens up avenues for better collaboration, opens up avenues for destabilization. So again, thinking of the ecologist framework, we go through these cycles of stability, rigidity, collapse, and reorganization. And so the question for me on the top of my mind is always, how can we reorganize the system in a way that is better attuned to stakeholder needs and more prone to peace and less prone to conflict. So Carl, you've spent a lot of your career grappling with this, both in situations post-conflict that have had peacekeeping missions, and more broadly in peace building. What are you seeing that works?
I think I'll start with just the really big picture and then dive into a couple of things. the most exciting thing is what I see as a profound change in mindset. When we were talking about this 15 years ago, there was such resistance. The security community, you did not use the E word around them, environment. You'd be shown, you could talk about natural resources, land, minerals. There's a political economy around that, but you don't use the word environment because that was irrelevant. That's something you do once you have peace. We had an amazing project that just kind of brought a lot of different lessons. It was supposed to be an edited book, 15 case studies. It got out of control. We produced 6 books, 150 case studies, over 200 authors. And that really, we found that there were people that were working on these issues. It wasn't that we invented it. We just provided a space. And there were people working on these issues in the environmentalists who were working in Eastern DRC or Rwanda and trying to protect the mountain gorillas and throughout the conflict. And they thought of things differently than the normal environmental community, the mainstream environmental community. And then you had the security people. And the security people who worked on environment, they were viewed as Birkenstock-wearing, bunny-squeezing, granola-crunching, tree-hugging liberals. They were not real military. And all these people were, you have the development people, the humanitarian people, they were all on the margins of their respective fields. And they started coming together around these books, subsequently around the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And the language, the concepts, the exchange, the support, we now have degrees in environmental peace building. We have officers, we have grants. There's a world of change in how we look at this. One of the things that I would highlight as a specific opportunity, there's been a lot of analysis over the decades on the problems. The question is, what should people do? I mean, if you're a program officer and you've got $10 million to invest in this space, what do you do and what's the basis for that decision? And we're seeing a growing number of body of research. Some of it is actually just capturing what people have done, because this has been happening. With the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of on-the-ground operations, and they had to do something. And the academic community was kind of off doing other stuff, so they just did things. And the practitioners got out in front of the academics, whether it was in Liberia and timber, or Angola, or Mozambique, or Peru. There was a lot going on, a lot of experimentation. We're starting to now take stock of that. And we're seeing even within institutions, your point of inflection. This is something I really think about a lot, because there's a lot of stuff that's happening, and they're trying to use an evaluation as a point of inflection to say, okay, we've done all this, we're now trying to take stock and move forward. And this has led to a new journal on environment and security. You mentioned the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. It's also important that it's not just interdisciplinary, it's transdisciplinary. And you're including not just the researchers, but the practitioners and the communities. There's a lot of very exciting evidence about the power and potential of cooperation around energy with the European coal and steel community. That was the basis for the EU and in the Balkans, around water, most notably in the Jordan River, and I'll come back to that in a moment, around protected areas, including in Peru and Ecuador, with the Cordillera del Condor ending the conflict. And I think the Jordan highlights a caveat, the Jordan River, that there's a lot of amazing work that EcoPeace Middle East and Arava Institute and others have done. And the situation there is worse than ever. It's not their fault. Environmental peace building and environmental cooperation can only do so much. And we need to be careful about thinking of it as the silver bullet and placing too many expectations on it. The final thing that I would say is that there's been a dramatic change over the last 10 years in how we think about gender. It's not that we weren't thinking about it before 10 years ago, but for years and years and years, it was all about protection, gender-based violence, vulnerabilities. We are now building the evidence base about what happens when you empower women. It leads to better project outcomes. The outcomes are more likely to be sustained after the project is done. Different values are brought in. We saw this in Timor-Leste, where there was a post-conflict effort to manage coastal resources, and it was all about fisheries, and then they talked to the women, it's like, yeah, but what about gleaning and all these other activities? And we find that it's not just a question of protection. I'm not saying we need to put that aside. It's that there's much more to gender in this space than protection. And you can have your outcomes more successful, more sustainable if you undertake these certain processes. And I think that's the final point, is that this space is very challenging because the environment people say, well, security is not our mandate, this isn't what we're trained in, and there's the converse on the security side. But thinking about it helps you to achieve what you want to do. And I think we need to be very clear about communicating to our audience, how does this help you? Not just how does it help the world, but how does it help you in achieving your mission? Thank you.
Excellent. We are just nearly out of time. I promised that this would be a conversation with you. It's the start of a conversation with you. We've opened up the first places for conversation, the first steps in a conversation. And I hope that this conversation will continue afterward. There are many, compelling issues and critical issues that have been raised around how to build conflict-sensitive institutions, how to build joint action, how to rebuild trust in institutions, rebuild faith in systems, and importantly, how to build data sets, how to build knowledge, how to build models that can enable us to have these really critical interdisciplinary conversations. So a couple of just pitches, and for those students in the room, for those researchers in the room, a couple of institutions and organizations that I really encourage everyone to get in touch with to start these conversations, to contribute to the work, is the Saltzman Institute, the Environmental Peace Building Association. And then for those modelers, I have to just highlight the work that CEASN does and the Socioeconomic Data Application Center, CDAC. For those who don't know, here at Columbia, we have one of the NASA data centers that's focused explicitly on building these and warehousing and encouraging the use of these socioeconomic data in models, in our climate models, in our peace and conflict models. And so would really encourage everyone interested in trying to crack this modeling problem to reach out to CEASN and get to know those data sets and contribute to those data sets. With that, I really want to take a moment and just thank my colleagues for sharing their expertise, their knowledge, being willing to have this conversation with you all, and encourage you all to join us, or join me in thanking our colleagues.